The Whispering Shadows late one night, in a small, forgotten village at the edge of a dense forest, a young woman named Emily returned to her family home. She had left many years ago, escaping the eerie feeling that always seemed to follow her there. Her parents had passed away, and now the house was hers, but it carried a heavy, unsettling atmosphere. From the moment she stepped inside, she felt a chill run down her spine. The walls seemed to murmur, and the shadows danced like they were alive. She brushed it off as fatigue, thinking it was just her imagination running wild. The house had always been old and creaky, after all. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she heard a faint whisper. It was so soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder with every passing minute. She sat up, her heart pounding. The whispers were coming from the walls, moving from one corner to another, as if someone was walking around, talking in hushed tones. Curiosity got the better of her. She followed the whispers, creeping down the dark hallway, her footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floorboards. The whispers seemed to lead her to the old basement door. A cold draft seeped through the cracks, and she felt an icy hand grip her heart. Gathering her courage, Emily opened the door and descended the creaking steps. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, almost like a chant. She could barely make out the words, but they felt wrong, ancient, and malevolent. The basement was pitch black, save for a small flicker of light in the far corner. As she approached, she saw an old mirror leaning against the wall. The whispers were coming from the mirror. Her reflection looked back at her, but something was different. Her reflection didn't move as she did. It stood still, grinning wickedly. The reflection's eyes glowed with a faint red light, and its mouth began to move, whispering words Emily couldn't understand. Suddenly, the reflection raised a hand and waved. Emily froze in terror. She wasn't moving, but her reflection was. The whispers grew louder, now echoing in her mind. Panic set in, and she tried to turn away, but she couldn't move. Her feet were glued to the ground. The reflection's grin grew wider, and its eyes blazed like fire. Then, with a final, echoing whisper, the reflection reached out from the mirror. Emily felt a cold, bony hand grab her arm and pull her closer. She screamed, struggling to break free, but the mirror's surface rippled like water, and the reflection began to drag her in. Her voice was swallowed by the darkness as she was pulled deeper and deeper into the cold, whispering shadows. The next morning, the villagers found the house empty. The basement door was wide open, and the mirror lay shattered on the floor. But no one could find Emily. Only the whispering shadows remained, and sometimes, late at night, if you listen closely, you can hear a faint whisper calling for help from the depths of the darkness. The old well in a quiet, unremarkable town. There stood an abandoned well in the middle of an overgrown field. The well was old, with stones darkened by moss and vines creeping up its sides. The townspeople avoided it, especially after sunset, for it was said to be cursed. They whispered stories of the well's dark past, but no one dared to venture too close, fearing the fate of those who had gone missing around it. One summer, a young boy named Thomas and his friends decided to explore the field. They had heard the stories, but dismissed them as old wives' tales meant to scare children. Thomas, the bravest of the group, proposed they go to the well and see for themselves. His friends, nervous but excited, followed him. As they approached the well, they could feel the temperature drop, even though the sun was still shining brightly overhead. A cold breeze blew through the field, rustling the tall grass, and they could hear a faint, low humming sound coming from the well. Thomas leaned over the edge and peered down into the darkness. He could see nothing but an endless black void. Suddenly, the humming grew louder, and he heard a faint voice calling his name. Thomas, Thomas. It was barely audible, like a whisper carried by the wind. He stepped back, startled, and looked at his friends. "Did you hear that?" he asked. They shook their heads, but their faces showed fear. Determined to prove there was nothing to be afraid of, Thomas grabbed a rock and tossed it into the well. They listened for the sound of the rock hitting the bottom, but there was only silence. Then, the humming stopped abruptly, the air grew still, and the silence became deafening. Suddenly, a splash echoed from deep within the well, followed by soft, sinister laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The boys panicked and ran, leaving the field in a hurry, but Thomas, curious and unafraid, returned to the well later that night. He brought a flashlight and a rope, determined to uncover its secrets. As he reached the well, the air grew colder and the moonlight seemed to dim, casting long, eerie shadows across the field. He tied the rope to a sturdy tree nearby and lowered himself into the well. The walls were damp, and the air smelled of earth and decay. The humming returned, louder this time, echoing around him as he descended. His flashlight flickered, and he heard the voice again, closer now. "Thomas, come closer." When he reached the bottom, he saw a pool of dark, stagnant water. The surface rippled, though there was no wind. His heart pounded as he shined his flashlight around the well. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone, and they seemed to pulse with a faint, ghostly light. Then he saw it, a figure, pale and thin, standing in the water. It was a child, a boy about his age, with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural grin. The boy's mouth moved, but the voice came from all around. "Why did you come here, Thomas?" Thomas tried to scramble back up the rope, but it was too late. The water began to churn, and a pair of cold, bony hands reached out from the darkness, grabbing his ankles. He screamed, trying to pull away, but the hands dragged him deeper into the water. The figure in the water smiled wider, and Thomas felt a freezing cold seeping into his bones. His flashlight slipped from his hand and was swallowed by the water. The darkness enveloped him, and the last thing he heard before being pulled into the abyss was that sinister, echoing laughter. The next day, the townspeople found the rope dangling from the well, but Thomas was gone. The field grew even quieter, and the well seemed to hum a little louder at night. And now, when the wind is just right, you can hear a faint, chilling whisper. "Thomas, come closer."